Well, hi everyone. This is Dean Woodbeck from InCommon. Thanks for joining us today for IAM Online. And it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session, Tom Barton from the University of Chicago and Internet2. Tom?
Thanks, Dean, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining today's IAM Online, the monthly webinar focused on identity and access management. I have to tell you that IAM Online is brought to you by InCommon, Internet2, and the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. Like always, we're going to be taking questions and comments using the Zoom chat function, so do send those messages along during the presentation. And I will be breaking in on Michael, our main presenter, to pose questions at appropriate times, so we don't have to wait to the end. You'll find that chat button along the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you have to take a close look, unfortunately, because it defaults to sending questions just to Michael and Dean and I, and no one else can see them. So please go ahead and if you click that drop down, you'll see there's one that says all panelists and attendees. Send to that so everyone can see what everyone else is asking and saying and doing, okay? So, Michael, if you would get me started here. And by that, I have to say, by the way, I'm noticing that there's almost 300 people attending this webinar. That's amazing. Thank you very much. And Michael, you are already a rock star, so it's only downhill from here during the rest of the hour. All right. So we're going to be talking about some way in which we're trying to make authentication stronger than it's been, and Lord knows it has room for improvement. Sometimes security people like Michael and myself think about users as the weakest link in security, oh, those awful users. But the fact is, that's not fair. We IT people put them in that position because we said, hey, you have to use these stupid things called passwords to access everything. And so, you know, they're just inherently weak links in security put in the hands of people who really don't want to have to pay attention and shouldn't. And this is unfair, and I apologize in advance to all the application developers who may be tuned in, but I say in the same kind of tongue-in-cheek way, the second weakest link are the application developers who, you know, put all their, who are attending to what they're paid to. You know, they need to like write things to manage HVAC systems or do payroll and stuff like that, or, you know, manage a telescope, and not really to worry too much about logging in and other security matters. So that's been the case, and so we want to see, well, what's changing? Michael, would you please advance? So think back about, let's say, 25 years or so ago. There's a user, there's an application. The application had within it, you know, it would ask the user to log in. They would give their username and password. It would check it. The app would have those two things. It would look in its user table and its integrated database to see if the username is there and if it has the matching password, and if so, we're all good. And they were happy, everyone was happy, question mark, but that's just the way things were. There wasn't anything else to do, basically. Advance, please. So after a while, you know, users kind of got sick of having to have a password for every single application they needed to do their jobs, at least in an enterprise context, maybe a little different out in the web, whereby that old model still is often the case in the web, just a user giving a username and password to an app. But so the enterprise, you know, at some point started to develop what we now call identity and access management programs, or AAI programs, in the other side of the pond, and represented here with an LDAP directory service that would contain the passwords. And you told all the app developers, okay, stop giving out accounts to your app to each user, but use this enterprise one, and you can look it up this way. Advance, please. And so after a while longer, as more and more enterprises and application developers and others kind of get the hang of this new enterprise-y thing, security services that apps are built from or that are part of containers in which they run, different kinds of containers, begin to catch up and become the place that handles this login capability. Still username and password, but it's really kind of out of the app's hand at this time. And so we've let, at this point, at least conceptually, we've left application developers off of this particular hook. If you could advance again, please. So this goes a bit further. We haven't, to that point, we hadn't really protected users' passwords a whole lot better, made it simpler on them, and we've begun to make it simpler on app developers by having security services be the focus of these things. But here we actually start to restrict the exposure of those passwords by having federation technology in federations. Could be enterprise scale or could be larger like in Common or Edugain. But the point is the username and password goes to an identity provider, not all the way to the app or any place around it, and that's looked up by the IDP. And the IDP, identity provider, sends some kind of a claim saying, hey, the user's logged in, they're good, and here's some other facts about the authentication I thought you might want to know. Next slide, please. So finally, the latest change is that cell phones. We love our cell phones. They're really cool. They do all kinds of wonderful things for us. They're very capable. We love them so much we never want to be parted from them ever. And we want to be sure that if somehow they're lost or stolen, we don't want anyone else to get into our cell phone and do things as us. And so cell phones have evolved to be pretty good authenticators of their owners with biometrics. You look at them or thumbprint them or something or type in a PIN, and then that's cool. And so the question is, well, can you use that cell phone to represent the user in login transactions? And you can, and it's not just cell phones, of course, but that's probably why this is so valuable from a user perspective and so usable, this approach. So I think that's really, and then what they do, I mean, IDPs and enterprises no longer then, and for those cases, register passwords associated with users, but their devices in some fashion. And so, and also the user and their precious phone that's a part of themselves now, as far as their logins to stuff go, they're no longer contained within an enterprise. They are themselves. They are free to navigate various things across the web or include within that notion stuff at their enterprise, at their employers or whatever that they can also do. So that's pretty much the story that I wanted to kind of set the stage for why Michael can do what he's doing at Stanford. It took 25 years or so of development of all kinds of stuff in infrastructure out in the world and organizations as well as technical infrastructure on all of whose shoulders his solution is going to stand. I just wanted to say the last thing, that there's actually two technologies that can do this crypto goodness stuff and have the cell phones act for the users. One's very old, it's at least 25 years old as well, X509, that I think Michael's going to be using. And even though X509 was invented to solve this problem ages ago, it never could and never can for reasons I won't get into. There's also a newer one, new kid on the block called WebAuth, and that seems to have the legs to go both ways. So with that, I'm going to stop and let Michael take it from here and tell us what's going on at Stanford and all this crypto goodness and so forth.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. And again, it's Michael Duff here, the Chief Information Security Officer at Stanford University. And guess what? I have not used my Stanford password in a full year now, and it feels great. It feels like magic. So here at Stanford, we're leaving passwords in the past, and we're ushering in a new era of safer and simpler computing. And I want to share with you how we're doing that. It began with a vision. When I joined Stanford about 7 years ago, I had this vision of strong user authentication coupled with device posture checking at the application layer. And I knew it would take quite a while to get there, so I immediately started on the first steps. But as luck would have it, we had a series of incidents that I saw as catalysts, and they really propelled this forward. For instance, in 2013, we had a major breach that really compromised our core authentication infrastructure. And what that led to was, even though we already had two-factor as an option, it led to us requiring two-factor for everyone with no exceptions. So we did that back in the fall of 2013, and that was one component that we needed in place. Well, around the same time, we had a series of lost and stolen devices that contained unencrypted medical records. And that launched an encryption effort campus-wide. So here's our encrypt.stanford.edu website. But we know that it's difficult to get people to do things where it's opt-in. So you're looking at our goals that serve as our Northern Stars for the past few years here at Stanford. And that second one really is the key here, where we want to automate enforcement of standards wherever possible. And that led to a system that we call My Devices. The purpose of My Devices is to keep track of all the devices that are being used at Stanford, who's using them, what their affiliation is, and what the security posture of their device is. So you can ignore all the acronyms across the top there, but those are all of our authoritative sources of information that all feed into this one place that we call My Devices. And it allows us to do reporting and enforce when a device is not encrypted. And by the way, I wanted to mention that even though it took us a lot of effort to build this, the return on investment has been very high. And we all know that measuring ROI in security is notoriously difficult. This is one time where it is very clear and how much we've saved the university.
Hey, Michael, can I ask a quick question right here? You used the term secure. I guess I asked if I could ask you the question, but I'm actually going to just ask you the question. You used the term security posture, and I think there's a phrase security posture check or checking. Could you explain what that is?
Sure, and I don't know if the next slide helps or not, but the idea is we define certain criteria for our devices at Stanford. One is that they're encrypted. Another is that they have a password protected screensaver that activates after a certain period of time, and that they're patched. There are a couple other criteria, but those are the main three. And this system allows us to prevent devices from gaining access to our network until they've met those criteria. It gives them a grace period, so everyone at Stanford can go to mydevices.stanford.edu and see the status of their devices. You see my 3 devices there, and fortunately they're all compliant. It'd be a little embarrassing if they weren't, but that's how it works. And it gives you a 30-day grace period and sends you messages letting you know what you need to do to be compliant. So again, this has been very successful. So I'm not a salesman, but this is how I've been talking about what we've been doing at Stanford. And saying, imagine not having to use your username and password anymore, and yet be more secure. And of course, we all know this sounds too good to be true, but this is one of those rare cases in information security where we can actually do both simultaneously.
So, Michael, before you tell us that magic, there's a question, and it's really, does this stuff apply only to devices owned by Stanford or also personally owned devices? That is it really what connects to the network or what's owned by Stanford?
That's a great question. It applies to all devices, both personal and Stanford owned. One of the first things I did at Stanford was to amend the policies to say that any device that is used to access Stanford services needs to abide by all the policies, whether it's personally owned or Stanford owned, and that's how My Devices is designed. And really, that's based on the premise that risk follows the data. So if you're accessing systems and data from any device, that's where that risk needs to be addressed.
So this is a point that's generated a lot of interest. There's some follow-on, some related questions. I'll try to summarize some of it. Basically, they want to know, geez, if it's my device, and they kind of get that it's Stanford's data, so it's Stanford's liability, and we all have to kind of help Stanford, I suppose, if we're connected to this network to meet that liability. Does that mean, like, do I have to install some kind of an agent on my personal device if I'm going to use Stanford's network? And how do you keep track of all those things? If we didn't buy them, if you didn't buy them, how do you know, and so forth? So those kinds of questions.
Yeah, these are all really good. The answer is yes. There is an agent that we ask you to put on your device. If it's a desktop or laptop, we currently use BigFix. For mobile devices, we use MDM, which isn't necessarily an agent. It's more, it's built into the operating systems. And those report in the status. So what we do is we say, okay, if we see your device using the network and yet we don't see an agent reporting in on that device, then you're out of compliance and you get 30 days to remediate. And I noticed another question about guests, and we do have a guest network, and these requirements are not extended to the guest network.
Right. And this is always a sensitive point. Can you, Michael Duff's security chief, if you've seen the team that something's lost or stolen, can you remotely wipe their device? Or not just use personally, but you know what I mean? Can the Stanford do that?
Well, it is an interesting distinction because there are only a small number of people, I think roughly three people who can directly wipe devices. But we created a mechanism for individual users to wipe their devices through that My Devices interface. So if I lost my device, I would go into My Devices, click on it, and hit wipe device. Yeah, so, certainly I know is a sensitive area. Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions that relate to this, and I kind of want to keep things moving along, but I also want to respect the people posing the questions. I don't know, Michael, if there's going to be maybe a website you referenced towards the end of the presentation that addresses some of the policy and process aspects of this.
There is a website, and if you follow the links from there, you'll find it. But yeah, I see the quite very good questions.
Maybe you, me, and Dean can figure out how to look at the chat transcript later on and ensure that all of the questions that we don't address live right now get addressed in some fashion reasonably afterwards. We'll do that.
Sounds great.
So, but that's because, folks, but please give me this problem of having so many questions. There's not enough time for them all. That's a fantastic problem. With 368 people on the line, that's wonderful.
This is excellent.
Okay, so let's go on to because I bet folks with most every slide or little segment of slides, there's going to be a whole new set of interesting questions too. So let's sample more of what Michael has to tell us.
Okay. Well, again, you saw my sales pitch, and we're calling it Cardinal Key. And I just want to pause here for a moment to say this is our service web page, and we put a lot of thought into the look and feel because we wanted to make sure that the first impressions were really good. That when you look at this, you think, oh, that's something I might want to use. And again, we kind of did use the tagline of simplicity and security. So why are we doing this? Well, number one, as I mentioned early on in my vision of having stronger user authentication. Number two is protecting against credential phishing, anyway, I'll comment more on that later. We also want to identify devices. So one gap that we have with My Devices right now is if you are not using our campus network, let's say you're at home, or you only use a cell network, our enforcement point doesn't work, because our enforcement point is whether or not you get access to the campus network today. So we wanted an ability to do that gating at the application layer, regardless of where the device is. And finally, to me, the most important is the user experience, making things easier for everyone. So let's look at where we are today in terms of integration. We're fortunate here at Stanford that we have some highly centralized services. So we have one main VPN that everyone uses. So we integrated there. We also have one main web SSO mechanism that we integrated with. And the final step, which is coming very soon, is to integrate into our secure wireless. So I'd like to demo in picture form how this helps people and what the user experience is. So what we're going to look at first is using the VPN with the kind of old approach, username, password, and two-factor. So you open up the VPN client, you hit connect, prompts you for username, password. You do two-step, two-factor there, and then you get this other banner that you accept, and then you're connected. So that's what many people would do multiple times a day with Cardinal Key. You start the VPN client and hit connect. That's it. So I can't overstate how much this little change has changed people's life. In fact, the quote that I sometimes cite is it's life-changing for many people, and just how easy it is to get into the VPN. Let's take a look at the website. So this is very familiar to everyone. You're prompted for username, password, and then here at Stanford, we do 90-day. We set the cookie for two-factor for 90 days. So every 90 days you get prompted, and then you're logged in with Cardinal key. 99% of the time, you're logging in. You're getting to you go to your webmail. You go straight there. You don't see anything. You just go straight in. And every 90 days, we'll do two-factor, and then you're logged in. So again, 99% of the time, you go straight in, but we're still doing two-factor authentication every 90 days.
So, Michael, I want to stop you again to kind of get in some more of the questions that have been coming up. Mm-hmm. And there's really kind of two kinds in particular I want to focus on that I think they roll up to. One has to do with whether, so many auditors and security policies and so forth presume that there's passwords and have obligations upon password strength and password management and that kind of stuff. And, so there's kind of general questions about what do you do with the policy side of things where you've got something better, but, it says to do something that would be kind of a non sequitur in your environment. So there's that. And then I also want to connect that with, well, let's do that one first, and I won't connect some dots. I'll do it separately.
Yeah, Tom, can you say a little bit more about it? I just want to make sure I got the question right.
So, if you have in a contract, a data use agreement or a federal contract that says your passwords have to change every 30 days and be so strong, what do you do?
Well, okay, excellent question. And of course, what is it, NIST 800-63B? Yeah, that gave some guidance around passwords, and I think probably many people listening in right now are familiar with it. So even though we actually at Stanford, the bulk of the user population is not required to reset their passwords, but those in the HIPAA covered entity are. Although HIPAA doesn't prescribe the periodicity. So we're currently at 1 year, and I'm proposing we go to 3 years for the password reset. But yeah, if you know what, we really haven't encountered that problem yet with DUAs and how that might interplay with Cardinal key. But it is true with Cardinal key, you're essentially, in essence, you're always logged in. And so that's why the device locking is important, and we can touch on that later. But I know that's not a great answer to that question, but yeah, just mainly to say that we really haven't encountered that issue yet.
Yeah, sounds like you'll look forward to the first time you have to have that discussion with internal audit, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then the other one was, kind of was going back to the remote wipe and the fact, the kind of the difference between, there's an enterprise context, you're accessing Stanford's network, but it might be with my personal device, and that kind of tussle. There's a lot of built-in assumptions and other maybe even some legal regard about how far an enterprise can go. So I guess of the various questions of that sort, what I find most urgent is, do you tell folks before they, do they understand that, okay, they have to have this agent on, it's possible that someone else, not them, might wipe their phone or whatever, that those consequences are possible, are enabled if they decide to use that device to access Stanford's network?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That is explained up front, and what we say is they always have the option of using a separate device for work and from their personal, and very few people choose that option, but that is an option. And we actually go a step further at Stanford in our administrative guide. That's our policies. We actually list out all of the data that we collect and around people and what the capabilities of these systems are. So we're very transparent about it. But I should note that this is something that didn't happen overnight. We were actually a pioneer. We were the first we actually created the first MDM program, and that was about 10 years ago. So we worked through all those very, sometimes difficult issues, early on, and this is kind of building on top of that. But I understand that many others are still kind of facing those kind of questions at their universities.
Okay, so I'm going to let you go forward to the next use case, and maybe we'll catch up some of the other questions that are heading in a different direction in a few minutes' time.
And maybe I should mention, I did see a couple of questions I thought were really good about our 90-day for the two-factor, and really, and I know I'm the outlier here. I know most are on the order of a day or 30, up to 30 days. The reason for this is I have yet to see cookie hijacking, cookie stealing for this. And if your endpoint gets compromised, then all bets are off. So if or when we see these cookies that attest to the two-factor status, if we see those getting hijacked and used, and then we can modify it. But until then, but that would signal a bigger problem, right? That your browser is compromised. So anyway, that's my rationale on the 90 days. So let's go to the rollout. I'm going to share this, and we're getting to the more and more technical side. So the rollout plan is across 3 years. The first year was all the infrastructure needed. By the way, that I'm referring to Cardinal Key by itself, because all the My Devices infrastructure we built over a period of 5 years. So this is after that. We're now in year 2, where we're making little improvements and we're trying to gain broad adoption. And then we're soon to enter year 3, which is where we'll begin requiring Cardinal Key for central services. Supported platforms, here's our matrix. You're going to notice that we do have some, a number of red X's here, notably in Firefox and Android. And it begs the question, why would we roll something out like this that doesn't have full support? And it really comes back to that user experience, where we do have a lot of these platforms covered, and we didn't want to prevent a majority of the user base from taking advantage of these benefits while we wait for these other parts to be completed. We formally rolled it out in February of this year. This is our big announcement, but it's really been a soft rollout because we're not requiring it yet. But how do you do it? How long does it take? It takes about 60 seconds. You go to our Cardinal Key site, you do log in with your username and password, you do two-factor, you install it, and what that looks like is this. You're just prompted to pick a name for your device. It can be anything you want, whatever means something to you, and then it gives you a little profile to install. So again, really, it's about a 60-second process. So I know, before I go to this next slide, I know that this phrase has become quite prominent these days.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Said, when I think about our Cardinal Key program, 3 words do come to mind: quid pro and quo. And what we're providing as incentives are the user experience, simplified logins, and protection. But in exchange, we're asking for you to have an agent on your endpoint and that you meet our cybersecurity standards. So that's the balance there.
Let me ask, there's a number of questions that have been coming up. I'm going to sample some. And again, for folks, for questions that we're not going to have time to address, we're going to figure out how to get back to you and address them afterwards. So you won't get ignored indefinitely. So there was an interesting question about, is it possible for the same device to be registered by 2 different users? And if so, what would that mean for access to resources?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, good question. Um, we, well, I guess I should start by saying we currently recommend not installing Cardinal keys on shared devices. But you could, and if two people really were sharing a particular device, that would be detected. And what we do is we ultimately revoke those Cardinal keys.
And just to clarify, when you say cardinal key, you're using the term key, is that an X509 certificate packaging
Yes.
of a key? Okay.
It is, yeah, and
Yes.
and that yeah, thank you, Tom. You're absolutely right. What we're really talking about here is X509 client-side certificates. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Let's go on to take it from here about quid. We all want to hear how this quid pro quo stuff works itself out, Michael. So please
Okay.
tell us.
All right. Well, let's look at adoption. Let's look at our numbers. This is one of our graphics we use. Again, I just put this up there to kind of recognize the branding that we do around this and try to make it appealing. One way we've gained adoption, recently we added this banner to our main login page. So you see that blue box up there that says, hey, you can skip this page with Cardinal Key. And that's actually been very effective. It's kind of non-intrusive, and but it targets the people we want to target, which are the ones still using their username and password. And here's some recent numbers, just to give you a sense. Really, we're looking at on the right-hand side, the VPN numbers. This is the number of unique people using Cardinal Key for VPN. It's a little over 1,900, and 2,800 unique people using it for web single sign-on. Again, these numbers are very low, right? That's a small percent of our user base. But again, we did a soft rollout, and that's pretty much what I would expect with a optional service.
So there are some questions coming up that some of which I know that you'll answer in an upcoming slide, and I'll save those for later. But there was a question about key escrow. There are often obligations to escrow keys so that, you as the Stanford, as opposed to you, the individual user of the device, may need to unlock it, or especially in case the device needs to be recovered in some fashion. What do you guys do about key escrow?
Yeah, in this case, because of the way we're using it, we are not escrowing the keys, and they are generated by CloudPath. That will be in a diagram and how all this fits together. So I'll explain that part. But yeah, we're not escrowing these keys, although we do. I mean, just kind of complete the thought that we do escrow keys for whole disk encryption. So BitLocker and File Vault, those are escrowed. And that's when someone gets locked out of their machine, we are able to provide those keys.
Right, and that's a different key.
That's right. That's
basically. Right. Got it. And then there was another one while I'll catch you, is that you talked about that 30-day grace period to get your device back in compliance. And the question is, does that mean the Cardinal Key still works during that 30-day period, or what's the story there?
It's a little bit different for the grace period for Cardinal Key. The way it is today, if your device is no longer compliant, your Cardinal Key immediately is not, it won't work. So I'm considering whether or not to actually provide a grace period for that. But today you can still log in with username, password, and two-factor if you want. That's the fallback. So that's in my mind, is an open question on how we handle a grace period with respect to Cardinal Key. Yeah,
there's an interesting risk assessment to be done there.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And there was one other question I thought that was very fundamental about what all kinds of things can be issued Cardinal Keys. Just users, people? How about other kinds of things that might want to identify themselves over a network?
Yeah,
machines or departments, more than one, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. The initial focus was a specific user on a specific device. But the way we designed it contemplating that someone might just want to identify a device and not necessarily a user, but we haven't implemented that part of it. So that's the way it is now, a individual user on an individual device.
Thanks. And please go ahead and try to make more progress on your presentation at this point.
Okay. Well, one of my mantras at Stanford, and this is just based on my own experiences, that opt-in security doesn't work. And I'm going to add on a little addendum to that, that even when the benefits are overwhelmingly compelling, like Cardinal Key, you saw the adoption rates. It's pretty low. So one of our next steps, as I mentioned earlier in the phase 3 of the program, is enforcement. So we are going to enforce via by user or by service in Shibboleth. And I think that's a good lead into kind of what's the architecture around this? How does it all work? And that's where we're going next. So I'm going to start by showing an example of a certificate that, again, we rebrand this as Cardinal Key. It just helps people who aren't as familiar with PKI think about this. But again, it's a X509 client certificate. And a couple of things I'd like to point out here is that it identifies both the user and the device. That first part is my username. That last long part is a unique ID for my device. And interestingly, we make these valid for 5 years. So the idea is you get a new device or you enter Stanford as a student, you take 1 minute to get set up and you're good for 5 years. By the way, this was a long, you might imagine this was a long discussion. Actually took 2 years to decide on some of these things. So we can issue certificates to devices. I think most people get that, but we ran into this struggle of how to map Cardinal keys to devices in my devices. And we ended up realizing that, well, why don't we use our agent to tell us what Cardinal keys are on the devices, what certificates are on the devices, and say, okay, the agent, the MDM agent, or Big Fix in this case, says Cardinal key X is on this device, and that allows us to make that mapping in my devices. It probably isn't clear necessarily why this is important, but my devices has to make that association because we want to associate a Cardinal key with a status of a device. And here's what that looks like in my devices for my laptop. You see down at the bottom is the Cardinal key information, and you can click on there to view the information about it. But let's really get into how all this works. So this is the diagram of all the major components of using Cardinal key for like a SAML login to O365. So beginning over on the left, you have a client with a Cardinal key on it. You do the handshake with the IDP, and in that process, your Cardinal key or your certificate is validated. You want to check it against a revocation list. You're extracting components. Next step is you got to make sure that user account's still active, just like you would with any login. And then every 90 days, you want to prompt them for two-factor. And then the key here really is to find out if that device is compliant with our requirements. So we know which device it is now, so we check against my devices. And if all that checks out, the SAML assertion is generated and you're off to O365. So we identified 2 issues here. This was like our initial sketch of what should happen. And I circled 2 problem areas. One is this, the CRL check, which whether or not you do it through OCSP or an actual CRL list that you download, there's a lag time there that we consider to be unacceptable. Even if it's a half second, it's also a single point of failure that could cause major problems for this crucial logging in. And then my devices, it just so happens we didn't design my devices to be transactional, so we needed a real transactional system. So here's our actual architecture where we have what we call the cert cache, and it combines information from about the Cardinal keys from CloudPath, which is our CA, which generates our keys, and the information from my devices. It's actually packaged with Shibboleth, so it's right there. So it has all the HA features built in, and that's how we resolved some of those issues. Well, some of the questions I bet some of you are wondering, did we create a key? Did we create our own CA hierarchy, or are we using something else? Well, we did create our own, and we did the whole ceremony. I'm not going to read through all these things, but we did it right, and we filmed it. We rehearsed. It took an entire year to plan for this, and when we actually did it, it took 7 people and 10 hours. And here's really what we were trying to do. We had 4 key masters, we call them, and really it's all about the private key for your intermediate and your root CA. So we had a key wrapping password. We split that 6 ways, and we did it across 4 key masters. So it takes 3 of the 4 to reassemble that. We wrapped the key with that password. And then we split up the private key. We took the private key and we split it across 6 parts across the 4 key masters. Again, so it would take 3 of the 4 key masters to reassemble it. In hindsight, we probably should have used Shamir secret sharing instead of that last approach. But I feel pretty confident about that we're in good shape.
So I wonder if I could ask a couple of questions also at this point, Michael. You showed us how it's integrated with SHIB, and that leads to 2 other questions. One is, so there was something about the SHIB IDP, an extension you had to create to do this. And the question is that something you're willing to share with other folks?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we would be very happy to share that that special configuration we did. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
And the other, that's one integration. So you taught SHIB about cardinal keys, and I think you're going to tell us how you taught your VPN system about cardinal keys. And there was questions about, like, how do you use this with logging into a Linux system and so forth. And of course, there's going to be lots of other things that don't know and that aren't equal to the VPN or aren't something that you get through by means of an identity provider. Right. What's up with that?
Right, yeah, so the other major integration point, which speaks to the VPN one, and I'm not sure I have a slide on it, but simple enough to say that the other major integration point is our Radius server. And that handles a VPN. You can also use that from other systems. Linux machine, there's a 2-part issue there. One is making sure we have an agent on Linux machines that can feed us the cardinal key information. That's really the why we don't say Linux is supported yet, but that's coming soon. We can solve that problem. But yeah, really it's the IDP and Radius are 2 major integration points. And
Linux as an end user device is one thing. How about Linux as a server? You want to log into it. Can you do passwordless Linux logins as yet?
Not today. We haven't tackled that one yet. You could in theory, but we haven't tackled that one yet.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll just ask one other question because it might help clarify what this all really means. So there's a question about, I guess there's sort of, and I share it too to a degree. There can be some confusion about the device or the user of the device. Now, of course, the device authenticates the user, right? You require a PIN or something to log on to the device.
Yeah.
And you've somehow, when registering the device, bound the user. You know who the user is. So like when SHIB looks up in the, I recognize this device and it's all cool and it's kind of compliant, and I know that the corresponding user is, MDuff or whatever. And so that's what I'll tell the relying party is that MDuff logged in fine. What about, where there's public, if you talked about public terminals, but is there anything about the library, certain use cases that doesn't break doesn't break out accordingly, where there's multiple interested parties involved.
Yeah, again, we're mainly aiming for the single user device scenario. And although we do support VDI and that you're sort of sharing, sort of sharing it, or even if you had a shared device with separate, like a RDP server or something with separate profiles that are independent of one another, that would, we could support that as well. But that's not really our key use case for this. And I did see the question, and I think it's a really good question in the list there, that I should explain that this is a unique Cardinal key for each device. So I use 3 different devices for Stanford, an iPad and a Mac laptop and an iPhone, and I have 3 Cardinal keys, one for each of those devices. So again, it uniquely identifies the person and the device. And another way I think about this is really that mobile device model nowadays, where if I unlocked my devices and handed it to someone, they would have access to all my personal photos, all my personal email, because you kind of always logged into my Google account. And it's really that same model now, where if you grant someone physical access to your device, you're kind of assuming that you're already logged in and you have access to everything. So it changes. It really changes more than thinking on workstations and how important it is to lock those.
Well, let's let you get on, and I think you've got one more kind of phase in your slides to go. Let's let you do that.
Now, this next one is just talking about the cert cache and just a little bit of background information about that, in case anyone's interested in what it's written in, but we'll move forward on this one. Here's our certificate hierarchy that we created, our root and intermediate, and then again, we've referred to at the bottom as the Cardinal key, which is the 5-year lifetime. Okay, so you see the format of those. And then just in case anyone's interested, here's what our root CA certificate looks like, our intermediate CA. And this is important. We chose to use a SaaS solution for actually generating the Cardinal keys, and it's called CloudPath. The reason we chose it is because CloudPath is known to be good for getting certificates onto devices and helping to configure them, which has been one of the big stumbling blocks in PKI adoption for a long time. So CloudPath does have our intermediate key, private key, and that's of course necessary for generating these certificates. But the root CA private key is never online. It requires 3 people to reassemble, and that's from that what I shared with you earlier. So I want to touch on some of the key design decisions we made along the way. One is having 2-factor. That's really a key component of this. Building that whole My Devices infrastructure over the years. The decision to have device-specific user certs, that was a 2-year discussion on that one. And we discussed a lot whether or not we should revoke these certificates when the corresponding device is no longer compliant. But we decided instead to keep that ephemeral state information in My Devices. Whether something's currently compliant or not, because that could change from moment to moment. The long lifetimes, we chose a large key size, 4K. We did that whole ceremony, which was a big production, but kind of fun. We used CloudPath as our issuing service, and then we had to make those infrastructure accommodations to make sure we didn't have any single points of failure and that it was performant for logins. So some lessons I learned along the way. With a project like this, most of the calendar time was consumed by design decisions. And well, that speaks for itself. And my devices, that whole thing has been wildly successful. It took a lot of work to build. If you're ever interested in doing something like that, you can do it in a fraction of the time with some of these platforms that are now available. I think Netflix Stethoscope is still supported, and that has a lot of hooks in. Does a lot of things similar to my devices. That user experience is king, and making improvements is a really powerful impact on the user community. Very, very positive. Importance of branding, I can't overstate that. We put a good amount of time in that, make sure those first impressions are really strong, and that's really gone a long way for us. And then I come back to my mantra that opt-in security doesn't work. That's why, even though this is very, very successful, we will be ultimately requiring its use by user and or by service. So I think I'm going to stop there, Tom, and I'll just leave out this slide with resources on there that points people to some key websites, and then take any questions.
Oh, we can probably fill the time with the questions that haven't been addressed yet.
Okay.
One has to do with some of the details. What kind of, if you upgrade, your operating system, not just patch it, but to the next kind of major release or something, what happens is, do you have to re-register? Does the Cardinal key still work, for example?
Yeah, that will, yeah, unless you completely wipe your device. If you're just doing an OS upgrade or any, the Cardinal key will remain in place.
So basically, you're kind of relying on the OS upgrade process to preserve keys that have been stored in that system across the upgrade. Yeah, as they generally would, because all kinds of things would stop working if they didn't do that, right?
Yeah. The one thing that we've noted, and we knew this was going to happen, but it was we are seeing it as when someone takes a machine and mirrors that or transitions that to a new piece of hardware. There are plenty of tools that do that. It carries the key with it, and now you're on a different device. So we can see that happening, and we're just trying to decide what action to take in that circumstance.
Interesting. And so, so what about Cardinal key and eduroam? And I guess I would assume this really applies when a Stanford person is at an eduroam location, not on the Stanford campus. I assume that that's just the same. That's on Stanford's own Wi-Fi network, right?
Yeah.
But you're not doing Wi-Fi. You're not doing Wi-Fi as yet.
Well, it's great. It's a great question, because that is exactly what we're planning to do, and it's in the works. We're actually going to disable our current secure wireless as well as our main Stanford wireless and go with eduroam and guest. So eduroam will be configured to with ETLS to do Cardinal key, and I'm told that will work anywhere that eduroam is supported, because when that connection is made to the local radius server, the outside envelope says this is someone trying to log in who's at Stanford. That request gets forwarded to our radius server here and unpacked, and the login happens, and then you're able to use eduroam at another site. So yet to be tested, but I'm assured that should work. So Tom, I can't hear you at the moment.
Oh, sorry, I turned on. Sorry about that. Sounds like you're just going to be doing the standard EAP authentication method for using client certificates for authentication.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is great. Yeah, and that certainly works well across eduroam all over.
Great.
There's also more questions. Let's see. I'll have time for just one or two more before we have to take us out of here. There was, oh gosh, I'm kind of missing. There's so many questions. Thank you guys so much for all these great questions. How are the keys protected on the device? How do you, Well, have you thought about the possibility of someone, taking someone else's key and, using it to impersonate them?
Well, absolutely, and that it's a great question. It really gets back to the importance of locking devices, because if if I handed someone my iPad right now, they would be me. My Cardinal key would log them in and onto the VPN and onto all of our web services, and they would essentially be me. But I would argue that that's really no different from today, where if I logged in with my username and password on my iPad and gave it to someone, for the duration of that login session, you are me. But it's just a reminder, and that's why my devices criteria that you have a screensaver that locks after a certain period of time. For iPads, it's 15 minutes. That's an important control that we enforce, and so that's a compliance criteria to help people, not get bitten by this issue. If they left their iPad sitting around and a day later someone came across it, assuming they can't unlock it with the PIN or Face ID or biometrics, then you're in good shape. But again, I should mention one more thing, and this is, I know, a very common discussion, that let's think about the threat model that we're focused on here. The threat model is not even though I'm not as concerned about it, but the threat model is not the physical theft of one of these devices and someone using it. The threat model is the other 4 billion people on the internet that are trying to phish your credentials and use those to log in to services. That's what this is really protecting against, while providing a better user experience.
You're managing risk, as good security programs do. You're not trying to eliminate any particular category of risk, just managing it well. So we're just about out of time. We're going to have to leave this topic here for now. It's fascinating. There's a whole lot more to explore. If you could, Michael, go to the very last, or the next to last slide in the deck. Yeah. There's a TechX meeting is coming up quickly. There's a link someplace, maybe in the previous slide, to check out the program. There you go. And there's also Basecamp has been, for next year, so the location has just been locked in. It's going to be in Milwaukee again, which is great. So please do, and there's in the next screen, if you would, Michael, there's an evaluation of IAM online. So please, your feedback is actually used to try to make these things work better. I will also note, pursuant to this topic, I just learned that Duke University, well, I've known that Duke University is doing something kind of like this, but using the other technology that enables this, WebAuthn, and they've been lined up for an IAM online webinar to occur on January, I believe, 15th. Look for the announcement sometime in about 2 months from now. So that'll be great to kind of have these two to kind of compare almost side by side. So thank you guys very much. Thank you, Michael, very much. And we'll see everyone later. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you.